So the ways in which we're presenting the story are both, I think, familiar and a little bold. You know, there are tried and true techniques for telling this kind of story that we are definitely adhering to. And I think, you know, the cinematics and the storytelling in Mafia 2, one of the things that game was lauded for, and we don't want to go too far afield from that. With that said, the way that we're wrapping the story and the way that we're doling out information to the player is very different from Mafia 2. You know, without going into too much detail, we do have a mechanism in game and a way that we're telling the story that allows us to provide a little bit of reflection on some of your actions, to comment on, you know, the time period with kind of the knowledge that we have today without being too heavy-handed, to draw parallels between events of 1968 and events going on today. So I'm really excited about that, and I think when we roll that out, people will see like, oh, that is a pretty novel approach to telling this type of story, but we're not losing the drama of those moments. I mean, you're still going to have a scene where Lincoln is face-to-face with Sal, and it's intense and it's in the moment.
The kind of groundwork for open world games has been laid. And you know, we can introduce more sophistication, both in narrative elements, gameplay elements, and things like that. And I think players will get that. The thing that particularly excites me about the storytelling in Mafia 3 is the fact that it's very grounded and realistic and gritty. And this is totally true. I've often told Hayden that I feel like we've been allowed to do things and write things that I never thought we'd be able to write in a video game. I would say a lot of it is like, oddly enough, kind of philosophical ideas. For example, Father James is a very clear idea of how he views the world. Like a lot of games I don't think really go into that kind of thing. Like he's a Catholic priest, so everything he does is viewed through that prism. So it's about peace and justice and how the world makes half-hearted steps to try to achieve those things, but in the end usually fails. So a lot of that kind of stuff comes through. The fact that, you know, Cassandra is basically a black militant. Her kind of goal is to just tear it all down. Handling that the way we're handling it, you know, in a very authentic, sensitive way, I think is actually kind of rare in video game writing. And I think the fact that we even have those kind of characters is pushing boundaries. Because we have a large minority, you know, African-American cast. Our main character is mixed race. I mean, just the fact that we have those things, I think, is pushing narrative boundaries in video games.
So throughout your career, are there certain truths in gaming storytelling that you've learned where you realize this works, this doesn't? Or things that you really want to drive in?
Every time I think I know a truth, and then somebody breaks it, and you're like, oh yeah, no, that's awesome. There are no absolutes, right? I would say that at the end of the day, the one truth that I would subscribe to is that any game that is heavily reliant on character, which our game is, the characters don't have to necessarily be likable, but they have to be relatable. You have to understand why they do what they do. And in some cases, that means that you have to look at the villain and you have to think, you know, the villain doesn't view themselves as the villain. They view themselves as the hero in their own story, right? It's kind of a cliche, but it's true. And it works, right? It works for Darth Vader, you know, and it works for Sal Marcano. The other thing is just, you know, like, less is more, man. Like there, you know, I just feel like the best writing is, you know, has subtext and doesn't always reveal everything and lets the reader or the viewer or the player, you know, infer things. You know, and at the end of the day, how we tell the story is important, but it's less important than, you know, the story itself. And then the story itself in some ways is less important than, you know, the player engagement in that and the player's agency in that. So there are definitely some big reveals and some big twists and turns in the story, and I think some stuff that, you know, provides some really good payoff, especially for fans of the franchise. But I'm really excited about players sitting down going, man, you know, this thing happened between me and Vito. Did it happen to you? And you're like, no, man, that wow, how'd you get that to happen? This thing over here happened between me and Burke, or I kept this guy alive and it factored into the game in this important way later. And you're like, man, I shot that guy in the head. You know, that's important to us.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the challenges of writing for Lincoln, and specifically in terms of him being an open world protagonist? Like, is it possible to have a protagonist in an open world game that technically isn't a sociopath?
That ties into the whole, you know, every player's story is unique aspect of it. We kind of leave it up to the player to decide at a certain point who Lincoln is. If you want to be the Lincoln that swerves up on the sidewalk and runs over 15 pedestrians and then, pulls out a shotgun and kills a bunch of cops, that's your Lincoln. If you want to be the Lincoln who says, you know what, no, my war is against Sal Marcano and I'm not going to hurt anyone else and I'm going to do everything I can to minimize collateral damage, that's your Lincoln. That notion of that, I think, has evolved a little bit in open world games, and hopefully we're pushing that a little further and actually saying, no, it's up to you who this guy is. And it ties into the theme, does killing the monster make you the monster? Somebody like a Sal Marcano gets to their position of power by doing bad, horrible things to a lot of people. Like, you just don't wake up out of bed and find yourself to be the godfather of a, major metropolitan city. There's a lot of killing along the way. And so the notion is like, what does Lincoln think about that? Is he simply out to just exact his revenge, or is he out to potentially replace Sal Marcano? And again, that's, something that we leave up to the player to decide.
Is there some beauty in the simplicity of Mafia 2 that you guys look at, where there weren't a lot of activities in the open world,
Right.
but it almost helped empower the story? Do you worry about diluting the power of your narrative just by adding more activities, which people would expect in an open world game?
No, I mean, I don't worry about diluting the power of the narrative. I think that we're making it more powerful because the player is figuring out kind of how they go from beat to beat. And to be honest, the narrative is still a huge part of the game, right? And we have big tentpole missions, and strung in between this is each tentpole is all this other content that the player can consume. For the fans of the last game, there's absolutely still that strong narrative. There's the amazing cinematics. There's the great performances. I think Bill Harms and his group have done a great job with the writing, so there's really stellar writing. But then you're also going to feel like you're contributing to the narrative, and your experience getting from story beat to story beat is going to be unique, which I think is improvement, and is a way that we should evolve the franchise. So.
How do you take advantage of the 60s era without it seeming cliche?
It's all about doses and pacing. The temptation, I think, would be that, in the first 30 seconds of the game, the player walks out and sees a Vietnam War protest, and then a flower child, and then somebody passed out, and then somebody smoking a joint, somebody playing the guitar, and and then 5 flower children come walking by. And, so it's just the notion that you have to properly pace those things out. If you were to walk around New Orleans in 1968, you probably see a lot of those things. But it'd be over the course of days and weeks. It's not like you would walk down Canal Street and have the shotgun of 1968 blasted in your face.
Nixon racist. It ain't natural. Supreme Court says otherwise. This don't concern you.
Was the Gamescom demo kind of jacked up in that degree? Because it was a little bit of a shotgun blast, I feel like.
I think some of the areas, potentially, yeah, a little bit. But in terms of the world, I think it actually did a really good job of capturing what it'd be like in that specific setting, which is down in our version of the French Quarter, especially there in 1968. I think people would talk about some of those things just because it was such a crazy year. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. There were, Black Panthers, shootouts with the police in Ohio and in Oakland. So I think there would be a degree of that, of hey, the country's kind of, outside of the Civil War, is probably the closest the country's ever come to kind of fracturing and splitting apart. But we do balance those with other conversations. There's also another conversation in the Gamescom demo where there's 2 guys at the bar and one of them's just got drafted. And so their conversation isn't about these huge, existential crises that the country's facing. It's about a guy being sent to Vietnam and his buddy's like, well, shit, this sucks. Don't get killed. Ultimately, it's those kind of things come out, and how do they affect your personal life?
We could definitely go to some extreme and become so devoted to the time period and the authenticity, being realistic versus authentic, which I think are 2 different things. For us, I think it was a really good opportunity to look at that and say, can we create a backdrop that the player can explore and feel that tension and have that be the backdrop to our crime story. And then more and more we've tried to pull that out and make it not just a backdrop, but how do we have that inform gameplay, and how do we have that get involved in gameplay? And certainly the police system's a perfect example of that. Can we use the police system in a way that you haven't really seen in other open world games because of the time period, and have it be, treat Lincoln a little bit differently than you might be treated in other games because of the time period and because of his mixed race. I mean, the police system in our game is no joke. The police are not to be trifled with. They're not just a nuisance. The player's going to be looking over their shoulder, trying to understand where the police are and what types of things they can get away with when there's a police presence, because the police are they're hardcore in the game. But Lincoln also, because of his race and the fact that at the time and in the location, there weren't a lot of black cops, and certainly there are areas of the city where Lincoln stands out more than he would in others, and that's going to have an impact on him when he goes to those areas. And the number of police and their response to different things that Lincoln's does will change. Now, we're not shying away from the fact that Lincoln's a mobster and he's a criminal and he's going to be doing criminal things that will attract the attention of the police just because of that, right? But I think race also plays a part in it. We're not shying away from that, certainly. And then there's the language. We're not shying away from the language, and we want it to feel authentic. So there's things you'll encounter in the game that will make people uncomfortable, I think, but it's because we're trying to be authentic to the time period.
I mean, let's get to it. Like, are the police going to call Lincoln the N-word? Is that going to be a common thing?
There definitely is harsh language in the game. Yeah, I mean, and so, I think you guys probably even heard it in the demo. Yeah, we use the language of the time, and we've got writers that are sensitive to that and are trying to be true to the time period, and we're trying to get feedback on that from people that lived through the time period, and we're doing a lot of research on the time period to make sure we're being authentic. And we're not going to, it's not going to be constant. It's not, you're not going to feel like, every time you turn around, you're getting, barraged by, the authentic language of the time. But it's there. It's definitely there. And I think it's because we want to, again, capture that time and place and make people think about it and go, well, that's how it was, and we should be aware of that, right? And not shy away from it. I think we would be doing a disservice if we didn't do that. If we ignored it, right? I think we would, we would be naive at best to not include that.
I think it's one of the most exciting things about your game is having that weird level of immersion and almost role playing, where it's like few people have ever experienced this.
Right.
It's super, super rare that you're called a racial slur in a video game, not by somebody over TeamSpeak or something.
Yeah, right. No, totally. And there's going to be moments where you're going to want to act because of that, and you're going to have to think. You're going to have to think, do I want to really act? How do I want to act here? And do I want to react to it? And do I, and for me, just playing the game, that's been it has definitely put me into a situation that obviously I haven't encountered in my life, and there's other people on the team that have, and I think at the very least has given me a little bit more, it's been thought provoking and has made me think about, my experience relative to other people's experience in a way that I haven't before. And if we're not trying to get on a soapbox, we're not trying to preach, we're not trying to, cure anything with this, right? But if we make people think about race and think about their own experience relative to other people's experiences, then I think that there's something worthwhile there.
Yeah,
for
so
sure.
you want it to be a little bit educational.
Educational is maybe too strong a word. Thought-provoking, I think. We're not trying to be sensational, but thought-provoking, I think, is something that art is. All good art makes you think and stays with you. And if we can be thought-provoking on some way without being overly provocative, then I think that we've done our job.
Everybody's from Hayden over to production at 2K. Everybody's been very, very supportive of what we're trying to do, and we're very well aware of this. A lot of the topics we're touching on, race in the South in the late '60s, is very, very sensitive. But we think we're handling it, in a mature, authentic way that's been grounded in a lot of historical research. Nobody's ever told me, no, you can't do that, which is pretty refreshing.
There's no way that it can't be partially fueled by the Black Lives Matter movement as well, right? And kind of modern day events, does that fuel the writing at all?
Well, so we started working on the game well before some of that stuff. Before that specific hashtag, I would be, a moron if I sat here and said, we don't think about that stuff and that stuff doesn't affect us, or we don't have an opinion on those things that are going on in the real world at this very time and in the country today. I mean, that obviously we're here, we're human, I'm American. Like, I'd be an idiot to sit here and say that doesn't affect me and that doesn't inform some of the decisions that we make. But at the end of the day, we are focused on trying to tell an authentic story, a story that is centered around this character in this time period, going through these experiences, which are different from any experience anybody's having even today, right? Because of just, who he is and the time period and all that. So again, while everything, including every interview and documentary that we've watched, every interview we've read, every book we've read, those all inform decisions we make. At the end of the day, it's about how do we tell Lincoln's story? How do we make sure that the player feels like they've inhabited Lincoln? How do we have the player walk away from the experience going, that felt like an authentic crime story, a hard-boiled crime story set in 1968 in the South, in their version of New Orleans, our version of New Orleans, because hopefully the player feels like it's theirs too, but our version of New Orleans, and that it was, that was the game that they played.
Do you feel a lot of pressure writing for a protagonist and other characters that are African American?
Not necessarily. I feel pressure for writing just because writing is hard. And we have very, very high narrative expectations for what we want to do with this game and where we want to take it.
Do you have a message for the fans of Mafia out there about this game? Do you think they're worried about the direction or the change?
I'd seem obtuse if I said no. They're all excited, right? Because again, I'm human. I sometimes fall victim to reading comment sections, and there are people that are worried because we've changed the race of the protagonist. And I see this as an opportunity. I basically would tell people to, give us the benefit of the doubt and give us a little bit of time to kind of prove what we're doing with this. That we're still staying true to the universe and we're staying true to the authenticity of the previous game. But we've also heard a lot of positive, and I don't want to ignore that, obviously. And I think that I've been really heartened by that. And the fact that Vito's back in the game, I think people really appreciate. And I want to tell all the fans of Vito that are excited that keep being excited, because I think Vito's awesome in the game. The people that are excited about seeing the city and the story in a new time period, I think we're doing it justice. So be excited about that. And I do feel like at the end of the day, you're going to feel like this is a true Mafia experience and a true Mafia story. Like it ties back to Mafia 2 in a lot of ways. We do deal with some of the loose ends from Mafia 2, so I'm not going to say how or when or, specify anything, but the people that are worried that we are just ignoring Mafia 2, that couldn't be farther from the truth. From a narrative standpoint, we are absolutely committed to making sure that a lot of your questions for Mafia 2 get answered in Mafia 3.
I hope they take away an appreciation for the kind of gameplay elements, like the ecology of the world, an appreciation of how hard we worked to tie all those things around. I also hope they take away the notion that they truly experienced what it would be like to be in a version of New Orleans in 1968 as a mixed race man, which I think is very original in games. And also I hope it's just a fun and entertaining crime story, because at its core, I know we focus a lot on the setting and the racial makeup of the cast and things like that. But at its core, this is a crime story, and I think we're doing some interesting things with that too.